Hey there everybody, it's MarkCrilley. I'm back with another video. Today we're going to be talking about storytelling problems. I'm going to be giving you information on 10 different storytelling problems, things that you should try to avoid in your own stories, and hopefully give you some tips on how to avoid them. I'm going to be working on this illustration. It's a drawing that I made years ago in Taiwan. Just going to be adding a little bit of color to it, give you something to look at as we get into these 10 different things. Now the first one is this one. We're not invested in the characters and we don't care what happens to them. I make this the #1 problem that I have with almost any story. Happens a lot with movies. You're like, I just don't care about these characters. And it completely falls apart. If you don't care about the characters, you just don't want to keep watching. You don't want to keep turning the pages. Now, how do you make sure that we care about the characters? Well, you give us some scenes up top where we get to know them, first of all. And generally speaking, during these opening scenes, we get some sense of how they are dissatisfied with their lives, or there's some sort of challenge that they're facing, some injustice that they're suffering from. It's a tried and true technique for getting us to care about a character is to see them suffering a little bit. And that gets us on their side. I saw this movie called Parasite recently. Highly recommend the film, and they have a few scenes up front where we get to know this family that's very poor, suffering. You know, they don't have enough money. The place where they live is like being fumigated by this pesticide company that comes by. It's like flowing through the windows, and they just, all of that stuff makes us care about these characters, so that when the story really kicks in, we want to know what happens next. And so I would say that's the main problem, is maybe you haven't given us those scenes at the front where we get to know them, in particular where we sort of feel sorry for them, or we are brought in on their side and want to see them fix whatever problems they're dealing with in their everyday life. Let's move on to the next one. The story isn't built upon an interesting enough premise. Now this one is tricky for giving advice on, because, you know, coming up with a good premise for a story is a little bit like that eureka moment where an idea sort of pops into your head. And if you haven't had that eureka moment, it's a little hard for me to say, well, here's how you do it. You know, I would say basically most of what I've learned about storytelling, I've learned by studying the stories that I've encountered by other authors and getting a sense of how they made it interesting. One thing that I saw on Netflix recently, I think it's called Living with Yourself, and that has a really interesting premise. This guy accidentally clones himself, and he's dealing with a clone of himself. Right from the beginning, you've got just a naturally interesting premise. You've got something where the audience is like, oh, wow, I want to see what happens. This is an unfamiliar situation that I haven't really seen anyone deal with. So ideally, if you can come up with a truly unique premise like that, that's great. But even if you can just come up with something that's slightly unusual, slightly off the beaten path. You know, at the heart of the first Star Wars movies, you've got this sort of farm boy character, Luke Skywalker, who gets pulled into this adventure. Right now, you could argue that that's not such a wildly unique premise. It's been used before, this idea of the farm boy who is bored with his life, but then has a chance to do something interesting. But of course, he makes that premise interesting by way of all the details of you know, what George Lucas came up with to tell that story. So you can take almost any premise and make it interesting by way of your creativity. Let's move on to this next one. Number 3, there's not enough conflict. The stakes are too low. Now, we've probably all heard by now that conflict is at the heart of good storytelling. There needs to be some sort of problem that needs to be solved. But I added in here, the stakes are too low. You know, we've got to have enough of a feeling of jeopardy, maybe, that something really, if this problem doesn't get solved, there's going to be consequences, you know. So have a look at the problem that your main character is dealing with and make sure that the stakes are high, that, if this problem isn't solved, I mean, the obvious thing is it's a life or death situation. But that doesn't, you don't have to have every story come down to that. Maybe they're going to lose the house. Maybe, I don't know. In a lot of cases, like the character could lose their dog, and they need to find the dog by the end of the story. Well, if we care about that character and we've had some time with that dog, then that matters to us, and that is high enough stakes. Almost anything can be made to be high enough stakes if you keep working at it. So that's definitely one that you should examine. And I've tried to put these in the order of importance, that you don't want to, you definitely don't want to miss out on these first 3 or 4 that I think are pretty crucial to good storytelling. Here's number 4. The dialogue is clunky. The characters don't speak in distinctive ways. Dialogue is hugely important to good storytelling, and in a lot of ways, if your dialogue is really snappy, you can get away with a lot of other story problems just because we like listening to these characters talk to each other. And indeed, there's the perennial sort of slice of life story where arguably nothing all that exciting does happen, but we just, we enjoy seeing these characters hang out in the coffee shop and talk to each other. Well, if you are doing that kind of story, you better make sure that you're really good at writing dialogue. It's easier said than done. I feel like my dialogue is okay. I certainly would not claim to be a master at it, but part of the key is to make sure that the characters speak in distinctive ways. If you've got 3 or 4 different characters, try to make them have almost their own language when they talk to each other. Make them use different words, speak in different ways. I'm going to try adding a little bit of white colored pencil to this illustration, which I've printed on a kind of off-white tan-colored paper, and hopefully this will help to make the structure pop off the page a little bit. Yeah, I think it's working. And now let's move on to number 5. The story doesn't build properly. It peaks too early. We've all seen movies where the best part was at the beginning, where there's this great sequence right in the middle, which is fantastic, and then the rest of it is kind of a letdown because it can't top that amazing sequence in the middle. If it's possible for you to shift your amazing sequence to the end, then that's the ideal. We do like the feeling as saving the best for last. The audience likes to be carried on this journey where the momentum gathers, and the tension builds, and it gets more and more is at stake. The situation seems more and more dire. We care more deeply, and you save all that stuff for the end of the story, ideally. So a lot of this stuff comes down to plotting, and some people will sort of make up a story as they go along. Certainly there's no problem with sort of making up your story as you go, but you may find that once you've got all the key pieces in place, you may need to go back and do a second or third draft in which you shift things around, change things up in order to, work out some of these plot issues. Such as this one in which the story peaks a little too early, or it's not building in tension bit by bit. Again, I think with a sort of slice of life story, there's certain stories are exceptions to this rule. I don't mean to say that absolutely every one of these needs to be a problem for every story that you encounter, but there are certainly things to be thinking about as a writer. Let's move on to number 6. There aren't enough surprises. The story needs more twists and turns. People reading a story or watching a movie, they really do want to be surprised. And that certainly is, generally speaking, the result of plotting and working things out so that you can almost lead the reader to expect one thing, sort of throw them off the scent of what you're actually going to do, and then surprise them by having some sort of shocking, unforeseen development, some sort of connection between 2 characters that didn't seem to be connected, all that kind of good stuff. that we love to see in a story. Again, I think sometimes you almost need to plot out the story one time and then go back in and start complicating things, right? If it goes too simply from point A to point B and then the story's over, you need to maybe revisit this plot and start to imagine complications, twists and turns, surprises. Not necessarily a big twist ending, although if you're able to do that, that of course is very pleasing to certain readers or viewers if it's a movie. It can be tricky, though. You can get yourself into, as a creator, if you feel like you have to always deliver some sort of twist ending, you can become sort of imprisoned by that device. But in any case, there certainly should be some twists and turns along the way. Let's move on to number 7 here. Things haven't been set up or paid off properly. This is definitely something that happens when you haven't plotted the story out carefully with an outline. Things need to be set up. You can't have, especially like the solution to the problem that comes at the end of the story, shouldn't come out of nowhere. It's very unsatisfying if it's this sort of magic solution. We want it to be sort of seeded, they say, like you planted a seed for this early on in the plot. And sometimes, indeed, that it happens in the second draft or the third draft, where now that you know what you're heading toward, you can reverse engineer and set things up earlier in the story. Now, conversely, there can be a problem of having sort of set something up and then you never pay it off. And that's where we feel like there are loose threads at the end of a story. You certainly don't. You know, ideally, a story has nothing in it that is not absolutely necessary. You know, you've trimmed out all the fat, and all that remains is there for a reason. But sometimes, again, if it's just your first draft, you may have put something in that you thought was going to be cool, or you thought you were going to enjoy writing about, and then you never really go back to it, and that ends up being a loose thread that people, you know, reaching the end of your story will be like, well, whatever happened to that character? You made us care about this thing that they were dealing with, and then we never saw them again. So both of those things can be a problem if something comes out of nowhere that you didn't set up, or indeed you don't tie something up that you devoted time to earlier in the story. Now that was the 7th one. I've got a few more to go here, but I want to kick this into time-lapse, bring in old man time-lapse. I'm the only good thing about this video. And I'm going to add a little bit of white gouache, my beloved white gouache, and opaque white paint to sort of add a few more finishing touches to this. And then we'll be back with the last 3 storytelling problems and my ideas on how to solve them. All right, well, we've got enough of it done now that I can come back and finish things off here. Number 8 is a big one. The ending is unsatisfying. Of course, people will be almost angry with you as a storyteller if you don't deliver a good ending. And this is another one where there's no magical solution except to have plotted it out in advance. Try to, you know, sometimes they say, try to figure out your ending before you even write the story. You know, when you're if you can work in outline form and figure out, you know, basically the ending needs to solve the problem that was set up at the beginning of the story. If you can come up with something really interesting, then you know with confidence as you write the story, okay, I know I've got a good ending. I think the biggest problem is when you just hope that you're going to come up with a good ending and you just write the story, and what happens is you kind of paint yourself into a corner, and that's when you tend to come up with unsatisfying endings that just sort of magically resolve things. The Deus ex machina type of ending where the solution seems to come out of nowhere. I've got a whole series of videos on like one that's devoted exclusively to the ending of the story, one to the middle and also to the beginning of the story. I'll link to that as well as an entire playlist of all my videos relating to storytelling, writing, all that good stuff. But basically, I never attempt to write a story until I've figured out the ending. I don't want to paint myself into a corner. I don't want to invest all that time and then find that I don't know how to end my story. If you are the sort of person who cares deeply about having a good ending, I would advise working from an outline. Come up with an outline way at the beginning of your process and figure out where you're going. And sometimes that doesn't even involve sitting and writing. That you're going for a long walk. Sometimes you're puzzling over this plot in your mind, and then it hits you. Oh yeah, that's the way. That's the interesting ending, you know. And that allows you to set that ending up because you know that that's what you're driving towards, and you lay the groundwork for it so it doesn't come out of nowhere. All right, we're getting toward the end here. Number 9. You've broken the rules that you set up earlier in the story. These days, a lot of movies, a lot of stories have their own sort of rules. You know, there's you are imagining a world where there are certain things that are possible, certain things that aren't possible, and once you've established those rules, you really have to stick with them. You can't break the rules out of convenience. Of course, you can find exceptions to this even in the realm of great storytelling. A lot of people will look at even something like The Lord of the Rings and say, well, wait a minute, how come suddenly we can fly on a bird somewhere? And, you know, you can find examples throughout literature of stories that seem to break their own rules. But that doesn't mean that you should go ahead and do it in your story. Do your best to be consistent. And, you know, maybe you have to rewrite the rules. Like I said, you go back and change the rules in your second draft so that you're not breaking any rules. Basically, I feel like there's no excuse for you to have set up a rule and then you created this rule. How come you're breaking it? It just doesn't make sense to me. So that one, I feel, should be pretty easily solved so long as you've taken a moment to go back and change things. So as to make it consistent. And we come to the very last one I saved for last because I feel it is important. There's no emotional heart to this story. Sometimes we get all caught up with the plot and things that are happening and action sequences, and then we forget to focus on the heart of the story. There should be a sort of an emotional journey that the character is going on, as well as the sort of literal journey that they follow throughout the tale. And that all of that, you know, the sort of emotional heart probably does need to be set up at the beginning of the story. So let's say that, you know, there are estranged brothers, you know, two brothers who haven't spoken to each other for years. You set that up at the beginning, you keep returning to it throughout the tale, and then ideally at the end, one way or another, you resolve that story. If it's a happy ending, they are able to mend the fences and get along with each other. But that's just one example. And you'll see a lot of stories that involve a divorced couple or a couple that's on the verge of divorce, and by the end of it, they have patched things up. That's all with the goal of there being an emotional heart to your story, because we... you know, we are emotional creatures, we human beings, and a story that has no heart to it feels sterile. Whereas one that has genuine heart to it, well, look at Pixar. You know, we talk so much about how Pixar movies make us cry. That's because they have a lot of heart to them. There is an emotional story at the core of it, and they are always careful to make sure that emotional heart is there. So I think that brings me to the end of this. Hang on, I'm going to go ahead and grab my books so that I can say thank you to anyone who supported me by getting them. Like the drawing lesson, this has a story to it. Hopefully I didn't break any of my own rules of storytelling in this one. Mastering Manga, my book on how to draw in a manga style, and my latest book, The 2-Pencil Method. I really cannot say thank you enough to those of you who choose to support me by picking up any of those books. But I'm going to go ahead and lay down this pencil. I want to thank you all for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. And I'll be back with another one real soon.